Good evening. Welcome everybody to the 2026 Woelfl Seminar in Public Policy. I want everyone to know that this is named after the founder and first department chair for the Department of Political Science, Father Paul Woelfl. And Father Woelfl was dedicated to not only starting the political science department at John Carroll, but he was known for his teaching, his mentoring of students, his research, and his passion for public policy, which is why we have this seminar in our department. Our first Woelfl speaker was back in 1981, and we've had a lot of notable speakers in the past. To give you a couple of names, our very own political science and alumni Tim Russert was a Woelfl speaker, William Daley, Sherrod Brown, Jennifer Bruner, and others. So we've had a lot of notable speakers, and this year we are very excited to welcome Juliet Stumpf, who is all the way from Portland, Oregon, and she is the Edmund O. Belshon. Did I get that correct? Awesome. Professor of law at Lewis and Clark University. She is a foremost expert on immigration and criminal law, publishing numerous articles on the intersection of these topics. Her first article on the matter, The Crimmigration Crisis, Immigrants, Crime, and Sovereign Power, has been cited over 2,800 times. And so for those of you students who are interested, if that's a lot, that's a lot. That's a really, really great reception for the article. And that's according to Google Scholar, one of the citement sources. Juliet is also the co-founder of CNETS. Got that correct as well? Cool. It's a transnational interdisciplinary network of crimmigration scholars, and she also serves on the board of directors at the Innovation Law Lab. She was elected to the American Law Institute in 2022. She won the Leo Levinson Award for Excellence in Teaching in both 2016 and 2025. She also received the Carr Ferguson Award for Scholarship in 2020 and 2025. Prior to joining Lewis and Clark, Juliet taught at the New York University School of Law, as well as Leiden University. She clerked for Judge Richard A. Paez on the Ninth Circuit and served as a civil rights attorney with the U.S. Justice Department. I would also like to note that she has a Jesuit connection, having gone to law school at Georgetown, and she also has an Ohio connection, as she received her Bachelor of Arts in English from Oberlin College. So please join me in welcoming Juliet Stumpf as our Woelfl speakers.
Thank you so much. I actually really wanted to start by thanking Dr. Farrar for inviting me, and thanking the staff for making all the arrangements to get me here, and the political science department, who I have had actually a wonderful time meeting one after the other all through today. I have to say, it's really just been wonderful to spend the day here, to meet so many students here who are interested in immigration, political science, and really just kind of what's going on in the world. And I've been just really impressed with the level of engagement that I see here on an intellectual, social science, and just personal level from everyone I've met. So thank you for a wonderful day from my end of things. So, as I think we can agree, it's really hard to miss that immigration has been kind of a big issue these days. It's really hard to kind of miss what's going on our streets. We've just been seeing so many visible signs of immigration law enforcement. Students have been arrested for political protests. Hundreds of immigrants have been detained and deported, some even to places like El Salvador, where they have been detained in torture centers. Others are in Haiti, and there are even parents who are keeping school children home from school. Right? That's kind of what we're seeing, I think, around the country today. Tear gas has been filling city blocks, including in Portland, Oregon, where I live. Children were tear gassed at a protest not that far from my house, and they actually had to relocate a school that was near the ICE facility there. So we've seen lots of arrests, violence, in 2 deaths in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, and 37 in immigration detention. I've been struck by something in observing who is protesting, mostly ICE tactics practices, and what they say about why they're protesting. First of all, some people who have come out on the streets, join marches and protests, who have never done that before. as if they're first time, if there's something that's taking them out of their houses and workplaces to send them out into the streets. So until now, they'd kind of stayed home, but something has happened. A neighbor has disappeared, or someone that they know has been detained or deported. So that's one thing. The second thing I think I've been really struck by and kind of just seeing what's happening is that one of the strongest themes from the protests and marches around the country is a declaration that ICE poses a fundamental threat to our nation, right? And you can see this in different signs, like even from the abolish ICE to calling ICE, all sorts of names. But that's kind of jarring, right? The idea that ICE would be a threat to the nation. And I understand protest signs say all sorts of things, and they don't always, often try to, maybe do a little bit of exaggeration here and there. But it's a theme that you see over and over again. So ICE is a government agency, right? And so how could a government agency pose a threat to the government? It's part of the government, right? And I see all of you political science and history majors thinking, oh, yeah, actually, Stumpf, that happens all the time, all right? But regardless, I think what underlies that sentiment is this, that in some way, there's something about what seems to be a quasi-military force of men in masks, smashing car windows, and making seemingly indiscriminate arrests that's making people, many people, and not just sort of the usual suspects, feel unsafe and that feel like something larger is happening. So my question is, right, how did we get here? And what I'm going to do is start off by telling you a story that you may have heard many times, maybe in bits and pieces. And here it is. Because I'm going to tell the story, and I'm going to tell it again, and then I'm going to tell it again, and then I'm going to tell it again. Right? In the old days, says the story, immigrants came to the United States lawfully. They worked hard, raised families. They learned English if they didn't know it already, and they assimilated into American culture. The immigrants who come now are different. They flout the law. They snuck into the United States, committing a crime by doing that. And then once they're here, they commit more crimes, violent crimes. And they don't assimilate, right? The new ones segregate themselves. They reject American culture. They cling to their own customs and language, and they don't contribute to society. In fact, they take jobs that Americans, away from Americans, and they use the social safety net, right, that's meant for the people who belong here. And because of all of this, they're prone to crime, violence, infiltration by gangs and terrorists, and they create chaos at the border and in the interior of the country. So they threaten the safety of the nation. The story has a happy ending. There's a solution to this problem, and that is to enforce immigration law. If we fully enforce immigration law, increase detention and deportation, deport those who are here in violation of law, then we can prevent crime and secure our nation's safety and economic and social order. If we deport everyone to close the door, we can live in safety and prosperity, knowing that everyone who is here belongs here. This story is powerful. It has a plot, a beginning, a middle, as an happy ending, and it explains why we as a society can treat differently the immigrants who come now from the ones who came before. It delineates who is us and who is them. And in fact, that's kind of the pivot point of the plot line, right? We could say that immigrants threaten the good order of our society, and a happy ending is one that relieves the fear that immigrants might create that threat. So it promises a solution that resides in safety and belonging, and it does this through one of our most deeply held national values, that we are a nation of laws. So the solution that this story gives is fair. So I'm sure you've heard versions of this story from the current administration, but it's actually not a new story, right? We've been telling this story for a really long time. It's a recurring story, and it's powerful. But it's also inaccurate in several important ways that I want to spend some time surfacing. And those inaccuracies were harmful. that story is built on 4 assumptions that I want to pick up and examine. And in doing so, I'm not going to try to convince you that immigrants are perfect or even that they're better than U.S. citizens. Immigrants are people with the same good and bad qualities that everyone has. In fact, they are everyone, and Brian. But there are pivotal points in American history that shed important light on what's happening now. Hey, they also reveal how important it is to take care that the stories that we tell are accurate and that they don't do avoidable harm. So here are my the 4 assumptions I'm going to focus on that are inherent in the story that I just told you. The first one is the idea that U.S. law and policy has treated immigrants even-handedly and fairly back then and now. It continues to do so now. That's the first one. The second one is the idea that immigrants commit crimes in outsized numbers, including by being here in the United States without authorization. The third is that enforcing immigration law requires, how we enforce immigration law is to increase detention and deportation. And the last one is that enforcing immigration law only affects immigrants, not anybody else. So I'm going to spend a lot of time on assumption number 1, right? That is history, and so kind of to figure out what was happening back then. And one thing I want to do with assumption number 1 is prove to you that we have been telling this story over and over in a recurring way, and all the way up until the present time. And then I'll spend a little time on assumption number 2, this idea that immigrants are prone to committing crime. I'll spend a little bit of time on 3, and then I'm going to close and kind of finish up by questioning assumption number 4. So that's my plan. I often ask my students, at the beginning of class, I lay out sort of my whole agenda for the class. I said, okay, that's my agenda. Should we add anything to it? So I'm going to ask you to do that like Q&A today. So let's take up this first assumption, right? That U.S. law and policy even-handedly and fairly treated all immigrants the same then, and that it does so now. Because if that's true, then what that must be is that the old immigrants, or the ones who came lawfully, are fundamentally different from the immigrants who are coming now. So the first part of this idea is that back then, our laws in our society generously welcomed self-reliant, hardworking people. So long as they were self-reliant and hardworking, they could come. But there were actually 2 really important exceptions to this even-handed legal and societal welcome: Catholics and people who are not considered white, especially the Chinese early on, and then later on Mexicans. So let's start with Catholics, because I don't know, to seem relevant. Here's number 1, and here's right here is Catholics. Anti-Catholicism has been called the longest-running prejudice in American history by some, because for, well, centuries, Catholic immigrants were viewed not just as religious outsiders, but as a direct threat to the survival of the American Republic. U.S. residents had brought over from Europe, well, they kind of talking about Protestants here, memories of the Catholic-Protestant strife that had dominated Europe's political and social life and brought it over to the United States. So from the colonial era, really, especially through the 1800s, our nation was really suffused with especially anti-Irish Catholic feeling. So my mom's side was Irish Catholic, Boston, and that feeling really arose from those European roots. And the myth that sustained this anti-Catholic discrimination was the idea, it's called the dual loyalty myth, the belief that Catholics could never be loyal, independent, and self-reliant because they answered to a, quote, foreign prince, that would be the Pope, rather than the U.S. Constitution. So John Carroll, right at the namesake here, spent many hours and many pages trying to dispel this kind of anti-Catholic discrimination, slanders and misinformation. He fought proposals to make Protestantism, right, the state religion. And I can imagine him, right, sort of like he's trying to like found the first American university, trying to basically found Georgetown University. And in comes another anti-Catholic slander, and he has to stop that and go write some piece of paper to counter that. Now, he also wanted to keep foreign languages out of the church, right? He wanted to, he was advocating for replacing Latin with English in the liturgy, which we haven't cut. So just to give you a flavor of what level of vitriol that we saw in at that time about Catholics, just before the mass immigration of Irish Catholics to the United States as a result of the potato famine, in 1835, Samuel Morse, he was, Morse, in 1835 basically said that high levels of immigration, particularly from Catholic nations, is what would begin to threaten American democracy. So I've left up, you can read for yourself what he said, but I just wanted to point out the fact that the riot in ignorance of thousands of human priest-controlled machines, right, they will be suddenly thrown into our society and hand you through mud into pure water and not disturb its clearness. So that's kind of the level of vitriol that we were seeing at that point in time. We saw riots in New York, Philadelphia, my hometown of Boston, and they were exposés revealing the quote-unquote truth about Catholic nunneries. Right, they were dens of iniquity and vice that ultimately resulted in the burning of convents and Catholic churches. So the question is, how did the Irish get out of this big teacup and come to be seen as upstanding members of U.S. society, right? Because we don't really see this sort of anti-Irish sentiment as prominent in the United States, I don't think, right, these days. So before the 1880s, right, setting aside enslaved Africans, migration to the United States had overwhelmingly been from Northern and Western Europe. So even the hated Irish Catholics at least spoke English, and Irish immigration actually started to be seen as kind of traditional, right? Those were the traditional immigrants. And when we started to see Eastern or Southern Europeans coming to the country, that's where we started to see basically the 70% of immigrants coming from these new areas. The Irish didn't look so bad. And you started to see that old story about the Irish, right, sort of depraved Irish, drunken, crime-ridden Irish, it turns out maybe that was actually not the right story. Instead, we need to turn to this new group and tell the same story. So in other words, that old story about immigrants that could not assimilate was shown to be inaccurate, at least when it came to the Irish. The old immigrants had become familiar, and the new immigrants started to be scrutinized for their differences. And what did we see when we actually scrutinized the new immigrants? And who were these new immigrants? Italians. These are Italians, right, then bringing socialism, assassination, and the mafia to the United States. And I think if you look actually just at the way they're being depicted, right, the color of their skin, their size, et cetera, I think we really start to see not just anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic sentiment, but race really starts to creep in to the way immigrants are being depicted. So, Italians, right? So yes, we had one prominent nativist, Edward Ross, who wrote that Italians, quote, possess a distressing frequency of low foreheads, open mouths, weak chins, poor features, skewed faces, small or knobby crania, and this is my favorite because I'm not sure what it means, backless heads. They lack the power, he said, to take rational care of themselves. So I think it's this cartoon from 1903 really illustrates that sort of flood of Italian rats bringing gang socialism and poverty. Now, that actually brings me to the Chinese, because this story about the good immigrants, right, the old good immigrants and the new bad immigrant wasn't just about religion, it was also about race. So in 1882, the United States passed one of its first federal immigration laws. Unfortunately, it was the racist, restrictionist Chinese Exclusion Act. Right? So from 1860 to 1880, Chinese immigrants had actually been welcomed to lay railway lines and to engage in mining in the United States. But once that transcontinental railroad was complete and the United States sunk into a depression, we saw intense anti-Chinese feelings, particularly in the West where I live, right? There's actually a famous massacre called the Hell's Canyon Massacre, in which about 35 Chinese miners were set upon by white miners and killed. Their bodies were thrown into the river, and people didn't know about it until they started to float downstream. So the opponents of the Chinese accused them of failing to assimilate. At the California State Senate Committee, California was really active, this whole deal. They said they, meaning the Chinese, failed to comprehend our system of government. They perform no duties of citizenship. They don't comprehend our social ideas. And the great mass of the Chinese are not amenable to our laws. They do not recognize the sanctity of an oath. In other words, they are undermining our democracy because they don't understand us and they don't support democracy. These stereotypes did something even more, important than what we saw with the Irish and the Italians, because these stereotypes actually drove the outcomes and the language of two foundational immigration law Supreme Court cases, Xie Jinping and Fang Yuting. Xie was actually a Chinese laborer who lived in San Francisco, and he lived there for a very long time. One day he sailed back to China to visit his family. And on his way back, right, it's kind of a great visit, he had left with a re-entry certificate to make sure he could get back in. But on his way back, Congress passed the Scott Act, which barred him as a Chinese national from re-entering the United States to go home to San Francisco, and it invalidated all of these re-entry certificates that the Chinese had been able to get up to that point to come back. So the court used this case, Xie Jinping, and Fang Yuting, another Chinese laborer lived in New York, to declare that Congress had absolute power to exclude immigrants from the United States, and that this power extended to deportation as well. That's what Fang Yuting said. And that the power was so vast that it swept away constitutional rights, including the right to remain in a nation that an immigrant called home. So why was it so important that Congress have this vast power to exclude and expel non-citizens with only the barest of constitutional repeal? The court said, well, it's because the obnoxious Chinese were vast hordes crowded in among us who did not assimilate, whose very presence as a group residing in the United States constituted a form of aggression and encroachment. So the court says, if the government of the United States, basically through Congress, considers the presence of foreigners of the different race in this country to be, who will not assimilate with us, right, to be dangerous to its peace and security, then Congress can exclude them. So it's the presence of Chinese nationals living in hordes and failing to assimilate. Does this sound familiar? We'd heard this before a couple minutes ago. Was close enough to a state of war in the mind of the court to trigger a broad need to provide that level of sovereign power to Congress to control Chinese immigration. So this story that the old immigrants were better, that the new immigrants were inherently unassimilable, that they were dangerous to the good order of our society, that they were basically creating a state of war within our nation. This old story that the new immigrants were not like the old immigrants, were not the kind of immigrants who could become 100% American, that they would destroy the peace and prosperity of the United States, right? We see this again. But now we see it embedded in U.S. constitutional law, right? Our understanding of the power the Congress, and therefore the executive, has, right, to control immigration law. So what is the solution to all of this unwanted immigration? What does Congress do with this sort of vast power to exclude and deport? Well, a lot of things, right? But let's fast forward to 1924, when Congress basically tried to turn the demographic clock of the United States, right? From where it was in 1924, where a lot of people believe there was too much immigration of the wrong kind, Congress said, let's just rewind and go back to 1890 and only allow immigrants who reflected the demographics of basically Northern Europeans. So we saw the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act, which set national origin quotas, right? So only so many people could come from a particular nation, so long as that the quota reflected a whiter, more Protestant America, then those people could come in, but if they didn't, they couldn't. So it basically slashed Southern European immigration, and it banned almost all Asian immigration. You basically saw the Asiatic bar zone, and that actually worked. Before the Chinese exclusion laws, well before the 1924 quotas, between the time the Chinese exclusion laws were passed, before and after, there were actually thousands of Chinese immigrants who were coming prior to that time to work, to mine, to live here. After the Chinese Exclusion Act went into effect, 10 Chinese people came into the United States. That's how effective these laws have been. So maybe we can tweak the story to be more accurate in this way. Right? In the old days, immigration law was even-handed and fair, and immigration was open, and our borders were open to the hardworking and the self-reliant, but only if the immigrant was of a favored nationality, religion, and race. And those Chinese exclusion laws, the last of them was not repealed until 1952. So one question is, how do we undo these old stories? How is it that we actually did get rid of the Chinese exclusion laws? But something must have happened. And at least what happened with the Chinese exclusion laws was World War II. The horrors that the Nazis inflicted during the Holocaust was based on eugenics, this theory that the white race is biologically superior. Hitler had looked to the U.S., right? He looked for a model of how to legally structure explicitly racial and ethnicity-based laws, and found it in the Chinese exclusion laws and the national origin quotas. And also, China was our ally during the war, right? So to have these laws on the books actually kind of looked really bad under the circumstances. So after more than a century on the books, Congress actually put the old story to bed and repealed the last of those laws, as I said, in 1952. So this first assumption that law in our society has always treated immigrants even-handedly and impartially is important because it illustrates that this ancient, powerful story keeps coming back, right? It has great staying power. And then Americans see the holes in that story, and they do something to fix it. We accept the old immigrants, was the new immigrants, now we accept the old immigrants, we change the law. We put to rest stereotypes. Irish, turns out, aren't actually all that bad. We pour cold water on the inflammatory rhetoric, and we let it work in the frictions. But notice two things. Number one, as I said, right, the story has left its mark, permanent mark on U.S. law in Supreme Court cases that relied on explicit racism to make a constitutional rule about Congress's power and to make immigration rules. And since it's a constitutional rule, right, that precedent, Congress can't just undo it, can't just pass a law to undo it. And since it's precedent, the Supreme Court can't overturn it without admitting that it's been wrong for more than a century. So that story has become a foundational part of immigration law, and it's one that's really hard, right, to extract. So the story itself still is not ultimately put to rest because it comes back again. Let's move closer to the present day because the old story pops up again in public rhetoric about Mexican immigrants. The story goes that unlike the old immigrants, Mexican immigrants come unlawfully, they take jobs held by real Americans, they become illegal aliens, commit crimes, and refuse to integrate into U.S. society. Does this sound familiar? I hope so. So there is a grain of truth in this. There are about 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States right now. And Mexican nationals are a large proportion of that. But I have to ask you, we really need to ask, how did that happen? So remember when I told you about those 1924 immigration quotas that was meant to turn the clock back to a whiter, more Protestant America? Those quotas actually were not applied in 1924 to the Western Hemisphere, right? So Mexicans, Central Americans, Canadians did not have a cap on how many could enter the United States. So you still had to present yourself at the U.S. border and be allowed in, but there was no cap on the number of people of your nationality that could come if you were coming from a Western Hemisphere country. And over time, we saw Mexicans and U.S. agricultural employers developing a long-standing relationship that created circular migration. Mexican workers would come for a season, agricultural employers would welcome them, and then Mexican workers would return to the U.S. when that season was over. That's what I mean by circular migration, right? Passing back and forth across the border. And as I said, there was no cap on how many Mexican workers could come, and no rules against working in the United States if you weren't a citizen. So what happened to that? This is kind of an odd story, because what happened as a result of the civil rights era, right, when Martin Luther King and others fighting for racial equality, led Congress to strip explicit racism out of federal law. And one thing that happened there is that that movement got Congress to strip out the national origin FUTA laws and the immigration laws. But there was a compromise. Congress imposed worldwide caps on immigrants, on immigration, and they seemed race neutral. They set a maximum number of people who could immigrate from any one country. And Congress applied that to the Western Hemisphere. Congress knew what was going to happen. Okay? The problem was, right before 1965, Mexico and the United States was running what was called the Bracero program. You can kind of think about that as providing lots of temporary work visas to these largely Mexican agricultural workers, right, to come and work, mostly in the agricultural fields in the West and other places. Right? There was no limit on these visas, and at its height, it reached about 450,000 Mexican workers annually. Right? The Bracero program, Congress ends that in 1964. So if you're looking at the chart, here's this blue line is the Bracero program. It's kind of up here at 450,000. Congress ends that in 1964. That's where you see this blue line kind of going down here, and then passes these worldwide caps. And suddenly we basically see a rise in the number of quote-unquote illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, that kind of looks an awful lot like what the kind of immigration that we saw under the Bracero program over here. So what was going on is that the problem was that the 1965 cap did not account for the relationship that any one country had with the United States, right? We had a really long-standing relationship, as I said, with Mexican workers. And so when Congress set that worldwide cap in 1965, at that point in time, I said about 450,000 Mexican workers were crossing the border back and forth. Congress simultaneously ends the Bracero program, imposes the caps at about half of the annual flow of Mexican workers prior to that date. But the economic need for their labor remained. So when those caps went into effect, it instantly created a population of unauthorized, undocumented Mexican immigrants whose livelihood was tied to the rhythms of seasonal migration back and forth across the border. And U.S. employers and consumers who had been relying on this source of cheap Mexican labor, they were still there too. So Mexicans had experienced the border crossing them after Mexico ceded Texas and other lands to the U.S. after the Mexican-American War in 1848. But an entire population, the people remained in place while the border moves south. But the 1965 law, I think, was basically just as momentous as that moment in U.S. and Mexican history. But now the movement of the border was not a creature of geography, but a creature of law. created not by a line in the sand right next to the Rio Grande, but rather by a line in the statute that was less visible, but at least and maybe more powerful than that. So that's the first assumption. I have shown you that as each immigrant group arrives in the United States, the same story of lawlessness, crime, unassimilability is applied to that group. But at some point, the new becomes old, the story is put to rest, and sometimes, but not always, the harm is addressed at least in part. So let's turn to assumption number 2. But I've already started to refer to this idea that immigrants now commit crimes in outsized numbers, including by being here, authorization. And this story, I don't know about you, but the story seems to come up most when referring to immigrants of color, and in particular, Mexican, Latin American, and Black immigrants. So first I'm going to ask you whether we've seen this story before, and then I'm going to address this question of immigration, immigrant crime, and set out some myths and some truths. And finally, I'm going to address this claim about crime rates, immigrant crime rates. So, right, you might have guessed the story of immigrants as criminals is not new, right? Let's go back to one of those cartoons. It looks like they all basically came from the same era, but we see that the Protestants were basically saying this about Catholic immigrants. It was also said about Chinese immigrants. You probably can't read the text here, but it basically says the claim here is that immigration statistics for the past year show that the influx of foreigners was the greatest in our history, and also that the hardworking peasants, the old immigrants, are being supplanted by the criminals and outlaws of Europe. Okay? So the riffraff are coming in, and the new immigrants are taking away. So I want to kind of really focus in, though, on how this old story that I've been telling you also focuses particularly on immigrant crime. And of course, Catholics, did bet on the brunt of this. American Protestant magazine said that the floodgates of intemperance, pauperism, and crime are thrown open by immigrants. If nothing's done, they're going to carry us back to all the drunkenness and evil of former times. And it was actually mostly Catholic Italians that were really getting this sort of patina of criminality. The Collier's magazine labeled Italians as the most vicious and dangerous criminals. But it also said 80% of the limited number of clever thieves were mostly Jewish. So maybe these Catholics weren't alone, or maybe this is the invention of the backhanded compliment. I'm not quite sure how to take that. The Chinese, of course, were not left alone either. In fact, their criminality was a particular concern. Right? The crime statistics of the period don't bear this out, but they were accused of bringing gambling, prostitution, drugs, especially to the West Coast. And in 1876, Scribner's magazine noted, no matter how good a Chinaman may be, ladies never leave their children with them, especially little girls. So these words, right, these kind of slurs, I think, have resonance today in the story that's being told about immigrants now, right? Venezuelans join gangs, Mexicans bring drugs and crime, Haitians kill and eat other people's pets, and women and children are especially at risk. I think the next question we need to ask is why this story about the old immigrants and the new immigrants is so sticky. Why does it have so much staying power? Because as I said, it keeps coming back. Why do we keep telling the story and then blowing it up over and over again? I think at least in the modern era, it has to do with something that I've been calling commemoration, right? The intersection of immigration and criminal law, the way those systems intersect and the effects that combination can have. These stories, I think, are a way of painting all immigrants, or at least immigrants of unpopular ethnicities or nationalities or religions, as prone to crime. So what I want to do is take a look at that, right? These understanding stories, and uncover some myths and some truths about whether violating immigration law is a crime. Here's one. A lot of people assume, right? That being here without authorization is a crime, right? And that we need immigration enforcement to take care of that. But here's the myth. Being here without authorization by itself, it's not crime. Right? It varies. It's really been varying especially over the last couple of years. But about 60% of undocumented immigrants here in the United States have overstayed their visas. Okay, so overstaying a visa, that's what's called a civil or an administrative violation of law. You think about other examples of administrative violations. They might be failing to file your taxes correctly. It's tax season, I forget. Or failing to file them at all. Failing to re-register your car. I've never done that. So 60% of people who are unlawfully in the United States are overstays. They haven't committed an immigration crime. Right? They've simply violated civil immigration law. But what about the other 40%, people who cross the border without authorization? We do have laws, it's true, right? We do have laws that say crossing without inspection and admission by an immigration official is a crime. But ICE agents, right, the ones that we see on the street, they are not, they're not, when they're doing their regular work of arresting people, putting in detention, et cetera, they're not enforcing criminal laws in the interior. The arrests that they make are for purposes of deportation, putting people in deportation proceedings. And that is not a criminal proceeding. ICE officials effectuating our deportation laws are actually carrying out civil law. And since 1893, the Supreme Court has been really clear that deportation is not criminal punishment. So when immigration officials deport, when they detain someone in conjunction with deportation, they are not carrying out criminal law. In one scholar's words, ICE officials are street-level government bureaucrats pursuing administrative immigration law violations. So why do so many people think that unlawful presence is a crime? And I think one explanation for that is that our immigration system, our criminal immigration system, makes it look like a crime. Our system blends immigration and criminal law in ways that makes it really hard to distinguish between the two of them. So ICE officials have emblazoned police on their uniforms. That's actually a relatively recent thing that ICE has been doing. They carry firearms, they make arrests, they detain people in places we detain people who have been convicted of crimes in jails and prisons. So this is what I mean about the stickiness of the story that immigrants have a propensity to commit crimes. If it looks like a criminal arrest, if it looks like criminal incarceration, and it looks like criminal punishment, if the immigration bureaucrat looks just like the police, and the handcuffed person looks like a criminal suspect, how can it be anything but a crime? It's just that it's not, right? So as I said, the Supreme Court has said over and over again that deportation and immigration detention, if it's related to deportation, is not criminal punishment. So why is that important? It's important for two reasons. For one thing, immigrants in detention or deportation hearings are deprived of criminal constitutional rights, like a jury trial, or a right to remain silent, or a right to have a lawyer. That's the first step. Second, unlawful presence cannot be criminally punished unless the government has followed the Constitution and held a criminal trial. It's just that detention looks like criminal punishment, and deportation often functions like banishment, which if you do that to a U.S. citizen is a form of criminal punishment. You violated the Constitution. So that's one thing. That's to kind of think about what is a crime and what's not. Right? Yes, all unlawful entry, unlawful reentry, it's on the books as a crime. But query whether it should be. Because some people might say, yes, if you cross the border without asking to come over, that we should criminalize that in order to deter people from doing that. But let's go to that immigration crime that I've identified, like illegal entry and illegal re-entry, because I want to raise this question. Here these are actually their real names: improper entry and re-entry of a removed alien. That's so improper entry, we now call that illegal entry. Sounds almost criminal way. But here's my question. We usually reserve crime, right? Label a particular part of human conduct a crime when it harms people or property. If you think physical assault, theft, embezzlement, child abuse, crossing the border doesn't really seem to have that same valence of harm to people or property. As long as it's a victimless crime, also that category itself, I think, is troubled. But I think we do have to ask, how did illegal entry become a crime, improper entry? Well, eugenics. Right around the turn of the 19th century, right, white supremacist beliefs were common, and eugenics, right, this, as I said, the notion that we could improve the genetic quality of the human race by ensuring that superior races didn't breed with inferior races. So James Davis, who's Secretary of Labor from 1921 to 1930, he was a committed eugenicist, and he believed that we could apply principles of eugenics to immigration policy. So, for example, in 1923, he said, the U.S. must draw a distinction between bad stock and good stock, weak blood and strong blood, sound heredity, and sickly human stuff. And he paired up with Coleman Livingston Leeds, the U.S. Senator. He was an avowed white supremacist, kind of right out there, and they teamed up together. They were hoping to pass a law, kind of like the Times Exclusion Act, which would basically just bar Mexicans from coming into the United States altogether. But they ran into U.S. agriculture, right? The U.S. agricultural lobby, which was very relentless, as we know, fought Mexican labor, and they opposed completely cutting off access to that. So they did something else. Instead, they passed a law that criminalized crossing the border without being admitted by an immigration official, and raising the punishment for people who did that more than once. And the purpose, according to Davis, was to bar from entry, quote, the degenerate and the bearer of degenerates. Right? He was referring to Mexican women. So who are these degenerates? Right? Mexicans who might, as he was concerned about, sully the purity of the white race. So yes, entering without being admitted is now crime, and so is doing it again. But now the historians have uncovered where this law came from. Do we really still want to keep it? It might actually, at the very least, be worth revisiting whether it should be. And at least one district court, on the strength of one particular history of political scientists research, actually struck down the law as racially motivated, right, and therefore unconstitutional, but the appellate court took a look and upheld it. So it's still on the books. And then the other thing is, even if it makes sense to criminalize border crossing, because I think a lot of people would argue that it does, here's another myth. The idea that unlawful border crossing is a gateway crime that's going to give the illegal immigrants the propensity to commit other crimes once they enter the United States. So once you've started to do crimes, you're going to do other crimes when you get here. So what about this idea that immigrants commit crimes, and especially undocumented immigrants? They're the ones that come in without authorization. Well, yes, immigrants commit crimes. They're people. Immigrants are people too. It's just that they commit crimes at lower rates than native-born U.S. citizens do. I found this kind of surprising, but the research has been done by a number of different social scientists in a number of different ways. And basically what we see with this chart, it compares the crime rates of U.S.-born U.S. citizens with legal immigrants, so that's actually going to include some naturalized citizens, with undocumented immigrants. And it finds that the crime rates for all immigrants are lower than native-born U.S. citizens. The violent crime rate is lower, and that even though undocumented immigrants tend to be demographically in a higher crime category, which is actually kind of young men in the late teens through their early 30s, that they nevertheless commit crimes at lower rates. And here's one that isn't illustrated by the chart, but also another study by Michael Light. When undocumented immigrants move into a city, it's a certain percentage, a certain number move into the city and settle there. He found in his nationwide study that the crime rates in that city drop by a small but statistically significant amount. So much for this idea that immigrants commit crimes at higher rates than U.S. citizens. Okay, on to my third assumption. And this one, as I said, will be relatively quick. When we think about enforcing immigration law, right, what does that mean? Does it mean increasing detention and deportation of immigrants through arrest and detention, or you can think more broadly than that? Because I think our immigration system actually has two pathways to immigration, to lawful status in the United States. The first one is the one that we all think about, right? Somebody flies from outside the United States to come in, maybe they're married to a U.S. citizen or have an employer who's willing to apply for them, right? So they come in from from outside the United States and they get permission to come here and live here. But there's actually a second pathway to lawful admission in the United States, laws that Congress has passed. And basically, there's two kinds of those laws that tend to be connected to family or to humanitarian relief. So Congress has basically said non-citizens who have been here in the United States for a long time, who have close family ties, and deportation would wreak havoc, right, extreme harm on those family members, can stay, right, if they meet these particular picture. And that this pathway to status applies even for somebody who doesn't have any lawful status here, although the criteria are quite stringent. My point is that Congress created this pathway because it recognized that deportation has a larger consequence for the immigrant, for the family members, and the larger community, and that it needed to do something to make sure they could stay. And I'll mention one more pathway, and that's the idea that Congress also created a humanitarian pathway in the form of what they call asylum. So that people, if they were returned to their home country, if they were likely to be persecuted or tortured, then asylum law protects them from that and actually provides a form of lawful born residence here in the United States. So in other words, Congress created a system that allows people to apply in advance, but it also created another pathway to lawful status. And that means that full implementation of immigration law requires ensuring that both pathways continue to work, right? If one part of immigration law, right, the detention and deportation part, is shutting down the other lawful pathways that Congress created, then we are not fully implementing our immigration laws. It also means that we need to make sure that our deportation system doesn't create systemic violations of other laws outside of immigration law, like constitutional law. And that takes me to my fourth and final assumption. Let me tell you one story about how immigration law impacts U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents and our society as a whole. Yeah, tell you what is this one. So what happened in really just a couple of weeks ago in a community quite near my home is that a woman, Juanita Avila, was pulled over by ICE agents in her car. And she was dragged out, pushed to the ground. ICE agents kneeled on her back. She was shouting for her daughter, who had just arrived. Her daughter was a U.S. citizen. And after holding her for about 30 minutes, they released her because the whole time she had had her green card showing that she was a lawful permanent resident in the United States. She had it in her pocket, had never asked right before pulling her out of her car. I think the lesson of the story about Juanita Avila is that all of our rights are at risk when immigration enforcement overreaches. They didn't know anything about Juanita Avila except what she looked like. They suspected she was an undocumented immigrant and took these kinds of violent actions as a result of that, without asking whether she had any lawful status in the country, whether their assumptions about her were correct. Citizenship and immigration status is not a dichotomy, it's a continuum, right? What happens to immigrants affects everyone's rights, right? So constitutional rights, right? Like freedom of association, freedom of ideas. When we see immigrants, students being arrested, right, for participating in political protests. When we see Juanita Avila being pulled out of her car, and we see all of the violence and et cetera that we were seeing in Minneapolis. When rights to life, liberty, protection from search and seizure, it gets real when immigration enforcement moves from the border to our hometowns because we end up having a front row view. And maybe this explains some of the protest themes that I was so curious about on the signs in Minneapolis and at Portland as well. Right? The idea that government overreaching is not limited, right, to immigrants, but starts to disrupt the lives and liberties and the everyday fabric of our cities and our communities, right, wherever we are. And so I think it's critical to look at these pivotal plot lines in immigration history to understand how the groundwork was laid for what's happening now. And that this idea that immigrants threaten the good order of society and even compose enemies of the state, it's one of the oldest stories about immigrants and one that has time and time again been put to rest. We've proven it false, we need to put it to rest again. It's pretty tattered anyway, right? And I think what we need to do is just start to tell new stories, right? Ones that tell the whole story of our laws and the place of immigrants in our society as a whole. So thank you. And I love questions.
Time for questions. If Savannah can help run microphones, I will. So yeah, if you have a question, please raise your hand and we will bring you a microphone. Take yourself first.
Okay. Oh, hi. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I just have a question, and when we're talking about the stories that we have used historically to generalize, stereotype, and paint like the us versus them narrative, do you see any hope, whether in, that might be at a federal level, state level, or even just local government starting to change those behaviors of just painting the us versus them story? And if so, how? If not, okay. I understand why, but.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I kind of want to ask you that, right? Do you see hope? But when we, and it sounds like you might have an answer. So go ahead and I'll.
Well, I don't know. I think that there could be some sort of change in terms of like the now, but I think, I don't know, looking at different generations and seeing how we have like access to education and then like more access to like learning things, but also access to, social media now, integration of our like artificial intelligence and maybe creating situations that aren't real and just kind of reinforcing the narrative or, curating messaging that, again, just spits generalizations and stereotypes.
Yeah, so I think that's actually really important. You've mentioned, social media, right? Ways in which, AI, ways in which kind of technologies has come along and changed our world. But I actually think the only thing that's actually ever really changed anything is communities coming together and doing something about it, right? So I'm a law professor, right? So I would get asked if we do something legally to change what's going on, and not just what's happening today, right? But change the world in some way is going to improve it for social good. And I actually think that lawyers follow organizers and activists, right? That it isn't until people come out and start to organize themselves, right? I think we really see that in Minneapolis, where Minneapolis had already been organized as a result of Black Lives Matter. And so they took the tools that they already had that they had created, right, for one another. So some of them, changed them from something that was kind of on the ground to something that was more technological. People that text each other. There's a lot of sort of technological assistants that were set up. But the fundamental idea that people had come together to address something that they felt was not just happening to particular people who were not members of their community, but members of their community and in ways that were affecting the entire community. I really think that's the only way that's ever going to happen, and I think we really see it happening. Minneapolis got a lot of media coverage because it was a big deal. But I think a lot of this kind of organization, communication is happening in communities all across the United States. And I find that heartening. I don't know if it's going to do the trick, but I think it's the only thing that can.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. You had a wonderful talk. It was very educational, and I learned a lot from it. Something that I've seen a lot is ICE has gotten a lot of attention in the media and in the news. And something that I've seen a little bit is other government or police forces kind of, I suppose, opposing ICE. So is there a role where, like, checks and balances, or like our system checking itself, is a possibility to kind of put a hold on ICE? Like, what do you think about that? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting. Can I tell you a story? Yes. So under Obama, this program was created, I think, under the Bush administration, but it was the Obama administration that really rolled it out. It was called Secure Communities. And the whole idea, so if ICE is actually going to undertake a mass detention and deportation program, they have two problems to solve. And they would say you wanted to deport everybody here in the United States who was unlawfully present. You have to do two things. You have to identify them, because they're in communities all over our country, right? They're part of our communities, our towns and cities. Number one, and then you have to get them from where they are into custody. And Secure Communities actually did a really good job of succeeding at both things. So first they had to identify people. And one of the ways that they did that is that if a police officer, and this is still true, if a police officer kind of arrested someone, non-citizen, erroneous citizen, but arrested somebody, they would take them down to the station and book them. And ICE had actually managed to get access to and connect all of these databases, public databases, meaning run by governments, connect them all together so that the local police officer booking station, that information about that person would go to databases that ICE would tap into. So now they could find out that somebody who had been booked, arrested by a police officer, where they were. But they still had problem number two, right? They still had to get that person from where they were in that police station into ICE custody. And there were only so many ICE agents. So if the police released that person because they were done with them, right? They figured out they didn't have anything to charge them with on the criminal side, or that person they were out on bail, then they would be released. So what ICE did is they used something called an immigration detainer. It's a piece of paper. It looks a lot like a warrant. And it just has a form, and it said, you can send this to the police with the name of the person on it. And it said, this person is under investigation for an immigration violation. Please hold them in custody until we can come and pick them up. So now they could solve problem number two, right? The police would just hold them in custody for all of that period of time. The police all across the country received these forms and believed that it was mandatory for police to hold that person until ICE came, right? This form is very official looking. The problem, and what happened was, that's why Obama got kind of tagged with the deportation president label. She didn't really like, apparently, because he was actually able to deport over 400,000 people a year, and he got over 2 million people were deported during his term. The Trump administration during its first term tried to hit that number, and they couldn't. And there's a reason for that. And it's because organizers and activists, lawyers and police and sheriffs basically broke the back of the Secure Communities program. One of the problems with this, can you please hold this person in custody, was that it was kind of unconstitutional. Right? There's something called Fourth Amendment. And what court says, well, we're looking not just at the original police arrest, which you have to see whether that original arrest is valid. Was there probable cause that a commission of a crime? So when there was the decision made to obey this immigration detainer, the court said that's a second arrest. So you need to check whether there's probable cause of commission of a crime. And what you're looking at is a paper that says we are investigating this person for immigration violation, which, as you know, is not criminal. So what happened, actually this happened in Oregon, in Clackamas County, not far from my house, is a district court judge said, you can't hold this person, and since you've been holding her for 19 days, you may be liable to her for unlawfully holding her, imprisoning her, right, without constitutional justification. So it wasn't just that maybe the police were violating the Fourth Amendment, but the county might have been on the hook for hundreds of thousands of dollars because she was not the only one, right? In order to do this, thousands of immigrants were being kept in prison, basically because of these detainers. So what we saw in Oregon is every single sheriff went, oh, we're not paying attention to these detainers anymore because the court said we don't have to. Right? All of Colorado stopped obeying, and we saw sort of this domino effect happening as a result of that one court decision. And that happened not just because the case was brought and right, the court said that, but because it was a massive amount of organizing and coming to sheriffs, showing them this decision, convincing them of the constitutional issue. And that's to some extent why we ended up with sanctuary jurisdictions. It was one of every sanctuary jurisdiction, almost every write-up of a sanctuary agreement or promise or memorandum. You see that idea that we're not going to obey these immigration detainers. It was a tremendously powerful force. And so if we're thinking about hope, right? Yeah, I think there's hope. You just need to kind of figure it out, right? Yeah, well, it's always easy, but there really are strategies that work. And Trump was never able to get to those numbers yet. Yeah.
Hi, we met earlier, but I just wanted to thank you again for being here. This has been a very insightful lecture. Anyway, my question is, we recently saw SCOTUS strike down Trump's tariffs, so I guess what I'm wondering is, do you think a similar decision could be made in regards to some of the more controversial aspects of how ICE has been operating?
Yeah, oof. I'm not really sure about the Supreme Court. Actually, we'll have to see, right? But here's what I'm seeing. I guess I have two thoughts about that. Maybe one of the cases is ultimately going to trickle up is this question of whether ICE actually has the power to give itself permission to make warrantless arrests, right? So right now, the way that works is ICE, it's kind of like the detainer form. ICE has a piece of paper, and it says, I'm going to be able to go into this person's home or pull them over and arrest them without a warrant. Right. And no judge sees this paper before it basically kind of gets issued. So the warrant is one that would never, ever hold up on the criminal side of things, right? So but police officer just decided to issue a warrant, right, to herself and then go out arresting people. A judge would have a lot to say about that. It's not really going to happen because the law is so clear about that. So in some ways, we might see those kinds of issues, surfacing at the U.S. Supreme Court. But I'm telling you, I'm not really sure what the court's going to do because one of my jobs, right, is to kind of predict what courts will do. That's what lawyers are supposed to do. And this Supreme Court has surprised me, kind of over and over again. So I'm not sure what's going to happen in the Supreme Court level. But in some ways, maybe that's not as important as what happens at the district court level. Because the Supreme Court only gets to take so many cases per year. It's the district courts that are kind of doing the hard work of deciding and creating and developing our laws. Every day, right, they have to ignore the cases before them. And almost every district court that's heard this issue has said that type of warrantless arrest is unconstitutional. So right now, we're actually seeing, in my perspective, I don't think it's really as important what the Supreme Court says about this. If what's happening is that we have this bulwark of district courts that are not going to take it, right? They're not going to allow this kind of thing to happen. So I'm not saying that's happening in every district court. And of course, we have the appellate courts that can take all sorts of different stances. And that's where most immigrants are being held in detention, right? Is in less friendly, immigrant-friendly jurisdictions. But I think right now, what the district courts have been doing is actually kind of amazing, just to see the work that they're doing on an everyday basis.
Hello, thanks for your talk. I just had a question about like when you're talking about like the first assumption or the history of like Catholics in America. Like I myself and many like Catholics I know did not like really know that part of history like growing up. And like I think that's like the reason a lot of like Catholics especially like as like have become assimilated like and like also act in like similar ways to, like the Protestants were acting back in the day. So my question to you is just like, do you think that history has been like suppressed and like being taught in schools? Because to me it kind of seems that way.
Because you never learned it. Yeah. I didn't really want to ask when I was a kid, but people seemed really surprised that like my Irish aunt married my Italian uncle, and I was like, okay. Right, and everyone was like, "Oh, that was a big thing." Right? So yeah, I didn't really learn about that in school. I couldn't tell you whether that was on purpose. I think there are, especially in sort of the elementary school level, school curricula obviously can be a really big deal. Right? There's a lot of disagreement about what should go into that. We actually see that today, but I couldn't tell you whether there's sort of a conspiracy theory about it, but it is kind of curious that we actually do see so little in our, especially elementary school curricula, about discrimination and racism and that sort of thing. At least that we saw, that's been, our history is kind of suffused with the United States. But if it was there, we could talk about it, right? And you could actually learn how to talk about it. But it's not there, and you really have to kind of wonder why. Why is it?
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I think this was really needed, especially in these times. I guess I want to ask you to expand a bit more upon the identification of basically these branches of immigration and how there's like deportation and the percent of ICE, and then asylum and all of that. Specifically, when we're seeing how status at TPS is being reduced for certain groups, as well as like changes in processes, so like amendments in the Integration of Appeals Board, where they're trying to streamline the process, and this is stopping all the immigrants from fighting for their like their status and like anything like that. So I was wondering if you have anything to say about that.
So you asked a question that's kind of close to my heart because I teach civil procedure, right? So I'm a proceduralist, right? Certainly, right? So what you're talking about is very substantive, right? Let's get rid of TPS, temporary protected status. Right? Temporary protected status is it's kind of a permission to remain in the United States in lawful status, right? And it's granted when something has happened in the home country, like a natural disaster or massive amounts of violence, or it basically allows people from that nation to stay in the United States with authorization. So it's temporary in theory, but if it allows the person to stay here and kind of become a member of our community, work, marry, whatever it is that they're going to do. But I think the question that you're asking about, what about all of these sort of, in some ways, smaller changes as well, which I kind of will categorize as procedural pieces. So I think this question actually has two parts to it. It's really easy to see, kind of understand, I shouldn't say this, you can kind of get a sense of what a U.S. citizen is. I shouldn't say that's easy to understand because it's not anymore. And you kind of have a sense of what somebody who has a green card is, right? That's a lawful permanent resident, they have permission to stay here. But we actually have all of these statuses in immigration law created by Congress or sometimes by the executive branch by interpreting the Immigration and Nationality Act and creating all of these I kind of think about them as liminal or precarious statuses. It's temporary protected status, which is often renewed, right? So at the end of 18 months, right, the government, it actually kind of auto-renews until it gets, unless it gets canceled. So we have all of these sort of precarious statuses. And that means they're easy, they create forbearance through deportation, but at least on the surface, they're easy to get rid of. Right? You grant temporary protected status, you could take it away. Right? DACA is kind of looks like it's the same thing. You grant deferred action from deportation, or basically forbearance from deportation. It was created by a memo, and for a long time, that's all it was. Right? A memo that Obama signed, and a form that you could take to a government agency, and then you would get this thing called DACA, and it was forbearance for deportation and work authorization. So if we had all these sort of temporary precarious statuses, what the Trump administration is doing is trying to take them away. So I had two thoughts about that, right? One thought about that is that they look really precarious. It looks like you could just kind of knock that DACA over with a feather. But I've actually written an article called Woelfl Immigration Law that argues that rules like this, or certain kinds of rules like temporary protected status, DACA, deferred action, something called administrative closure, that they look precarious, they look like they could just be blown away, but they're actually really sticky. It's hard to get rid of them. Because when you try it, they keep coming back again. It's kind of like that recurring story, right? Keeps popping up again. When you try to get rid of DACA, right, and the Trump administration tried in Trump #1 and has tried in Trump #2 and can't do it. And I have some theories about when you have a legal rule that does that, right, that seems fragile, but is actually very robust. And some of that has to do with how the values that underlie that goal, right, this sort of idea that somebody who has grown up here in the United States, we shouldn't be able to simply take their precarious status away, right, and put them back in that sort of general box of undocumented immigrants, put them back in danger deportation. So I think that's one thing, right? Can the Trump administration do all of these things? Well, yes, in theory, but the district courts keep saying, actually, you're doing it wrong. You can't take TPS away. You're doing it wrong because of X, Y, and Z. It's a really sticky rule. I think TPS goes right into that box of liminal immigration rules. On the procedural side, I think that is, if not the most dangerous way of using immigration power, it's at least really far up there. And if you think about those warrantless arrests, as I said, it's what what ICE is using is an administrative device to obtain a criminal enforcement. So it's a form. There's no statute that says this is that ICE agents have different powers from police in arrests, or there's no sort of exception to the Fourth Amendment written into the Fourth Amendment, at least, right? That says ICE agents are special. So how are you get around the Fourth Amendment? You create something that's precarious. Right? It's just a form, and then you just use it. I think the detainer, actually, in the article, uses the immigration detainer as an example of these little immigration laws. So if you use them enough, and everyone believes that it's a real rule, right? Me and the detainer is mandatory. You have to obey it. You have to keep this person in custody. I worried that these, and I think this was happening for a while, right? That these warrantless arrests, ICE is kind of consciously or not seeking to create that kind of stickiness on that.
Hello. Thank you again for DACA. Your talk was awesome. Forgive my fogginess about this, but I think at some point the United Nations defined an idea for asylum and for seeking asylum, and the United States adopted it with their own spin on it. That's if you passed into the United States through a country where you could have sought asylum, and you did not, you cannot apply for asylum in the United States. why do you think that is? Maybe on a logistics level, but also kind of like on a historically, like on a narratives of immigrants in the United States level.
Yeah, when I was putting together my first asylum case, my client had passed from Northern Africa through Spain, and she spent a couple weeks in Madrid, and then she came to the United States. And so we had to actually research whether or not she would be subject to that, or the idea is basically that if someone is seeking asylum in the United States, that they could have settled or gotten asylum someplace else, right, on the way in, then you don't have to provide asylum laws. Like they don't meet the criteria, right? They meet an exception to the asylum laws, and we could say no. And there's a certain logic to that, right? So if you think about refugees as being a global problem, that's why we want the UN to solve it. That's why we want these international conventions to solve it, right? So how do we solve the problem of people being subjected to persecution, needing to flee, right? And so whose responsibility is that? And to some extent, maybe one way of thinking about the convention for the protection of refugees is to say, let's share that responsibility globally. So, and maybe the first country that person comes to should be kind of a primary country to take that on. So we can write into our laws something that says, if you could have done it someplace else, you should have done it there, and not ask personally. So we don't have to give you asylum, right? Because you could just have done it there. So that's, I think, the concept behind that. The problem is that that's often not realistic. I think what we often see, especially, for example, with people seeking asylum or coming up through Central America, for them to have stopped and tried to seek asylum in any of those countries, none of them at that point in time had a really functional asylum system, right? And when we actually look back at the statistics about people that we've denied more recently on that basis, I think the current count is that nobody, right, who was turned away because they should have sought asylum, right, in one of the countries to which they passed coming up to the United States, nobody received asylum. So, but when they actually reach the United States and they are able to present their asylum case here, we see that they actually fit the legal criteria for that, and we have granted equal and similar circumstances asylum. So something's wrong with that, right? Something's wrong with the way that's working, and asylum has to work, right? Or we're sending people back into places where they're going to be persecuted. But I think that's the rationale behind it, but it only makes sense to apply that rule if it's actually going to accomplish the goal that humanitarian protection is supposed to accomplish, right? Which is to make sure that people can actually obtain asylum. Yeah, it's a key question.
We have our last question up in the back.
So I know earlier this year, President Trump issued a third travel ban. I think it went into effect like January 1st, 2026. I know the administration has come into legal trouble in the past. The Supreme Court has defeated, I think, 2 of their previous ones, and he's tried to reshape it to fit the court rulings. Do you think the president should have this sort of authority to ban certain countries from immigration? Do you think that's part of presidential power, or do you think that's sort of a breach of what we should be standing for as a country?
So there's kind of 2 levels to your question, right? One is does the president have power? And the second question is, should the president have that power, right? And so one's a legal question. And the other, I think, is a policy question, right? Is do we as a nation want to, and maybe a sort of structure of democracy question. Right, so the first one, whether or not the president actually has that power. There's a case called Trump versus Hawaii from the first administration, right? Where remember Trump kind of had to like third time's the charm, right? First we ban all the Muslims, and then we ban all the Muslims and a bunch of other people as well. And then our third try is we're going to do something kind of in between with a lot more sort of evidence and substantiation of the policy, of the ban. And this the third one was the charm, right? That in that situation, basically the court said if what we were dealing with was a situation in which it was a clear, racial or religious ban. But that's not what we have here. Right? Now we have something where the president is relying, for example, on the previous president's determinations about whether or not these countries pose a risk to our country. Right? So that the court, in essence, and to be honest, I don't agree with the court's conclusion here, but that's how the court kind of defended that upholding of that third travel ban. So does the president have the power? According to the Supreme Court, if you do it that way, yes. Okay? Trump versus Hawaii was important for two reasons. It upheld the ban, but it also arguably, for the very first time, allowed more judicial review of a policy of exclusion of immigrants than we have ever seen before in the law and in kind of the cases after the Chinese exclusion. So when I teach this case to my students, I actually, the case actually gives immigration courts and the lower courts a little bit more leeway in reviewing executive action than we were really seeing before that point in time. So that's the one. He said that the policy question, one, the answers that might be, well, do you like the policy? Right, because sometimes that's how we answer policy questions. Right, I don't think it's good policy because we can come up with some arguments about whether or not, for example, we are chilling religion when we allow that policy to be upheld. But I also think the other thing we need to think about is whether that level of power that we're facing in the executive branch is that really good for the structure of our Constitution and the way that we use our laws, right, to kind of to govern our democracy. So if we are okay with providing that level of power to the presidency, the executive branch, then maybe we're starting to rethink the balance of power, right, between the executive branch and especially Congress. I think has really kind of taken a back seat when it comes to exercising its power for seat. I had another thought, one other quick thought about that, and that's just this idea. Trump versus Hawaii and every travel ban, this is one of those situations where I think people tend not thinking about it very much. You kind of go, oh, we're really just keeping immigrants out. But the immigrants who would be coming in under the travel ban, permanent residents who are coming in, coming and being admitted from outside, are being applied for, petitioned for by family members or employers. And actually sometimes by churches, as a category for special religious groups. So we're not talking about just any immigrants. We're talking about immigrants who have close connections to the United States, with an employer who values that immigrant so much that they're going to go to the trouble, right, of getting them through that whole immigration system to get them to come here. Or a family member who's close enough, spouse, child, parent, and sometimes brother and sister, a U.S. citizen, right? Those are the family members that we're talking about. So we're not just keeping out, any immigrants. We're keeping out the immigrants that have those family ties. And when we say no, right, to that travel, we impose that kind of ban, we're harming the U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents who have that connection to a petition for that person. And I'll say one last thing about that, which is when we do that, when we impose a travel ban, right, like the Chinese Exclusion Act, or right, the 1965 worldwide poets, that creates a demographic ripple that basically extends forward for conceivably centuries, right? I live in a state, Oregon. It's one of the whitest states on the West Coast. And that's because in Oregon's constitution, the state barred black people from living in the state. It's just black people has to be out by sundown. And you know what? It's 2026, I think, right? And the demographics of Oregon are really, really similar, right, to the way that was then. It's a super white country, it's a super white state, and that history is why. So when we make these choices now, we're making them for the future.
So thank you, Professor Stumpf, for joining us today. Thank you all for being here. I also want to thank especially, and Professor Stumpf mentioned this, but Professor Farrar for all the work that she did to set this up. We can give her a round of applause. She did fantastic. And thank you all for attending. I hope you had a wonderful evening. I hope you learned something. I hope this was thought-provoking, and we hope to see you next year at our Woelfl seminar.
the